Thank you for the kind introduction and thanks for inviting us to present our research today and discuss issues regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. So my name is Dario Sansone. I'm from the University of Exeter, and I will present today with my co-author Kit Carpenter from Vanderbilt University. And the plan is to start by mainly focusing on why you should care about these issues and why you should also study these topics. And I will then provide an example of a descriptive study on LGBTQ plus issues. And then my co-author Kit Carpenter will spend a few minutes on discussing an experiment on these issues before moving to discuss some initiatives that have been implemented, especially from the American Economic Association, in order to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the economics profession. And we hope to leave around 20 minutes at the end for the Q&A. And we discussed that already, and I think most of you are probably more interested in point 1 and 4, so we will try to focus actually on that. So the first reason why I think you should care about LGBTQ issues is that this is not a tiny percentage of the US population. It's actually quite substantial. It is increasing over time. In 2020, in the US, 5.6% of Americans identified as LGBT. And actually, once you go and check the percentage among the younger generation, you see that it goes up to 16% among Generation Z. So it's increasing and it is substantial. And this is true not only in the US, but also around the world, where in countries such as Spain, Australia, or Brazil, you have 5% of the population identifying as lesbian or gay. In countries such as India, you get up to 9% of individuals identifying as bisexual. And it's also interesting to see countries such as Sweden, which have up to 3% of individuals who identified as asexual. So I think that this is something that can be studied all over the world, not only in the US or in Western Europe. And one could actually argue that this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's true that a lot of people identify as LGBT, but more and more individuals are also identifying as queer or not exclusively heterosexual. So once you start to put everything together and to look at the share of adults who identify as LGBTQ+, this is comparable in many US states to the share of African Americans or Hispanic individuals. And so if you care about public policies, you may want to investigate how these policies affect not only other minorities or women, but also LGBTQ+ individuals. And if you care instead about business performances, or if you work in marketing, then you may argue that this subgroup has not been targeted in the past. And so firms may actually increase profitability by focusing on them. I also want to point out this paper written by our co-author Lee Budget, in which she makes the case for LGBT equality. And she argued that we may care about LGBT equality because it's a human rights issue, and that's an important case for equality. But you can also make a business case. And so you can also care about equality if you care about the bottom line. Indeed, she provides a lot of examples about how discrimination can affect firms' ability to hire and retain workers, especially high-skilled workers, and therefore how it can affect productivity, revenues, and profitability. Similarly, recent papers show that there is a positive relationship between firms' LGBT equality and the rate of innovation and performance within the firm. So again, we may want to care about LGBT equalities both for a human rights perspective, but also from the point of view of firms' profitability. And so we can make this business case. So all in all, I hope to have convinced you that there is something also for you to study. And actually, I want to emphasize that really there is so much that we don't know about these issues. And I will argue some of these research questions are low-hanging fruits. We just need people starting working on these issues and starting publishing research on them. For instance, we know how many in the top 500 firms, how many CEOs are African Americans or women. We don't know how many of them identify as LGBTQ+. And similarly, we don't know what kind of challenges are faced by transgender managers, or more generally, what is the workplace environment faced by transgender workers. There are also some policies that are being implemented around the world, such as quotas for transgender workers, especially in the public sectors. And we don't know how effective they are, whether they are needed, and whether they increase representation of gender minorities in the government, and whether they should be applied in other countries. Similarly, more and more countries are creating LGBT chambers of commerce. We don't know whether those boost actually profitability for LGBT businesses, whether that's because they increase overall economic activity, or there's a drawback for non-LGBT businesses. I will also argue that there is not enough being written about the intersection between sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, gender, and disability. We don't know, for instance, what are the specific challenges faced by lesbian women of color in certain contexts. And in many cases, the challenges faced by those individuals are different compared to challenges faced by gay white men, for instance, cis men. And for those of you instead more interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence, I've done some research on that, and I think there is a lot being written about how these algorithms may perpetuate racial inequalities in society. But at the same time, haven't seen anything written about how these algorithms may perpetuate LGBTQ+ inequalities in society. And I actually think that these tools can be very useful and can be used successfully in many contexts. But at the same time, I worry that they may be misused in some countries, especially when homosexuality is still illegal. Similarly, I worry about protecting the privacy of employees, but at the same time, there is some potential in using HR data, especially when more and more firms are starting to collect information about sexual orientation and gender identity of their employees. We're also seeing some recent advances in employment discrimination laws in the US with the Supreme Court decisions, but also in many other countries. And so we may wonder how these are going to be reflected in HR policies and whether they're going to have an effect on how firms hire, how many minorities they hire, and whether they're able to promote them or not. And finally, I would argue that we know almost next to nothing about asexual and intersex individuals. And I would say that this is not because of lack of interest, but really because of lack of data. But I really hope in the future that this will change. And so I hope by now to convince some of you to start studying these topics. And if you are interested and you want to learn more about that, I will point out this recent paper that we wrote with our quarterly budget on LGBT plus economics. This is in the Journal of Economic Perspective. It's an entry-level article, so it can also be taught at the undergraduate level. And in this article, we provide an overview of the data available to study these topics and the most up-to-date estimate of the size of the LGBTQ population. We also provide some summary statistics on demographic characteristics, as well as reviewing the literature on same-sex marriage and wage gap differential by sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, this is entry level, and we are also working on writing a more advanced article for the Journal of Economic Literature, which we hope to share in the next few months or hopefully in a year, let's say. I know that I'm optimistic, but let's say 1 year, we will be able to provide this overview of the literature so far. So now for the remaining of my time, I would like to provide this example of how to make a descriptive study on LGBT issues. And this has been written by my co-author, Sonia Lefice, at the University of Exeter. And we are studying how mode of transportation to work is done, how these decisions are done differently by sexual orientation. As I already said, a lot of people in the US identified as LGBTQ. This share is increasing over time. And we have some evidence, although not coming from a representative sample, that sexual minorities care more about the environment. At the same time, we also know that most Americans drive to work, and this has a lot of cost for both the individuals in terms of health, but also for the general society in terms of climate change and air pollution. So we want to understand whether this decision of driving to work or not to work is related to sexual orientation. And so for the remaining of my time, I will mainly focus on the probability of driving to work, but I will also show some statistics on the probability of taking public transport, walking, or biking to work. And I will use one dataset that is being used by most researchers in the US when looking at LGBTQ issues. And in particular, I will use the American Community Survey between 2008 and 2019. And I will compare individuals in same-sex and different-sex couples. So why most economists have used this dataset? That's because it is nationally representative. It is a repeated cross-section. It's repeated every year, and it's very large. It's the largest survey available in the US. It's 1% random sample of the US population. It's which is sampled every year, which means that we can focus on specific subpopulations, such as the LGBT population. Now, there is no direct question of sexual orientation. However, we are able to identify individuals in same-sex couples. That's because we know how each individual in a household is related to the household head. And so we can identify same-sex couples by linking the household head to the same-sex spouse or unmarried partner. Importantly, unmarried partners are different compared to roommates. We are not looking at just two people living together. And indeed, previous research have shown that individuals in same-sex couples are indeed sexual minorities in a romantic relationship. So what I'm going to show you is indeed differences by sexual orientation. However, I will not be able to say anything about single individuals, nor DCS as any information about gender identity. So I will not be able, unfortunately, to say anything about transgender individuals. And that's something that until recently was common in most datasets in the US. So just to give you just some summary statistics, what you can see here is that both men and women in same-sex couples are less likely to work compared to men and women in different sex couples. Men in same-sex couples are almost 12 percentage points less likely to drive to work compared to men in different sex couples. And so almost by construction, that means that they are more likely to take public transport to work, and men and women in same-sex couples are also more likely to walk to work or to bike to work. Now, these are just raw summary statistics. I'm not accounting for any differences in demographic characteristics, fertility, marital status, and so on. But we can do that with multivariate analysis, with OLS. So in the top panel, I'm comparing women in same-sex couples to women in different sex couples. In the bottom panel, I'm comparing men in same-sex versus different sex couples. So column 1 are the raw summary statistics that I've shown you so far. But even when I include the state and year fixed effect, demographic controls such as respondent age, education, race, ethnicity, when I include also partner characteristics and the presence of children in the household, even young children, as well as marital status. After including all these controls, the gap is smaller, but it's still there. It's negative and insignificant. And the magnitude is quite large. If we assume that individuals in same-sex couples and different sex couples drove at the same rate, at the rate at which individuals in same-sex couples drove to work, then we will have 1 million fewer women and 5 million fewer men not driving to work. Fewer men driving to work in a year. Therefore, hugely cutting CO2 emissions, reducing externalities, and improving health, both individual health and public health. Obviously, these are back of the envelope calculations. These are simple estimates, but it gives you a sense of the order of magnitude. Then you may wonder why this is the case. And in the paper, we have a lot of additional tables, which shows that this gap remains, especially when comparing men in same-sex couples versus men in different sex couples, even when focusing on individuals living in the city center, when focusing only on married individuals married with kids, when taking account for occupational differences, industry choices, family income, when excluding students or people living in the, working in the military, when focusing only on certain age group, race group, ethnicity, or focusing only on the main earners or the household head, or using different functional forms assumptions. In all cases, we still see this gap. It may be smaller in some specification compared to other, but it's always there. So we conclude the paper by arguing that one reason why this may be the case is that sexual minorities may care more about the environment. And even if we don't have this information in the American Community Survey, we can see this in the General Social Survey. And indeed, we see that lesbian, gay, or bisexual individuals are more likely to say that the US is not spending enough developing alternative energy sources. Not reported here, they also say that the US is not spending too much protecting the environment. And they also report being more interested in environmental issues. So in conclusion, this study shows that sexual minorities may drive less to work, may be less likely to drive to work, to be more likely to take public transport. And one reason why this may be the case is because they care more about the environment. And we think this is quite important for policymakers, for health practitioners, but also for companies trying to create a healthier and productive work environment and schedule. And that's really all I have. I will now leave the virtual floor to my co-author, Kit Carpenter, and I'm looking forward to hear your questions and feedback in the Q&A section of the talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Dario, for the handoff. Can you all hear me and see my slides? Yeah? Okay, great. So I want to begin by just saying thank you to Dwight and Carolina for having the series, for inviting us. I'm so excited to be in rooms where I know a couple of you, I see some old friends, but most of you I don't know. One very small great thing about the pandemic, despite all of the horrible things, is that it created these virtual forums more actively than they were before, and you get to meet people that you wouldn't have otherwise met. And so meeting Dwight is a great example. I think we probably met during one of those Patrick Button social hours or something like that. So thankful for that opportunity. Thankful for the opportunity to share. I'm going to just breeze through this because I think most of what I'm most excited about is having a discussion with you all about kind of what we can learn from each other, what economists and informed folks can learn from each other about EDI initiatives. Before I do that, let me say that Dario is a wonderful co-author, and yet we are both presenting papers that we co-authored with other people. And I hope that you caught Dario's subtitle on his paper, which was Sissy That Walk, which is of course a reference to RuPaul's Drag Race. I can't wait to see that in print in some fantastic journal sometime in the future. So I'm just gonna be real brief and say, this is a project that is ongoing. I can send you a draft if you're interested. This is joint with my wonderful longtime collaborator, Shavat Aksoy, and some newer collaborators, including experimentalists throughout Europe. And we're trying to understand in this project kind of what drives anti-queer, anti-gay, lesbian, bisexual discrimination and what you might be able to do about it. And so in one slide, what we do in this paper is this is a randomized information experiment in Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. These are Eastern European countries where people don't like queer people that much, and they're happy to tell you that. And so what we're trying to do is debunk people's myths or see if we can change people's views by randomizing information to them. So we had 2,200 people and 700 people got randomized into treatment one, where we asked people how much you think sexual orientation discrimination costs your country. And then we tell you it actually is costing you about $320 per person on average per year. In treatment arm two, if you got randomized into that arm, we asked, do you think homosexuality is a mental disease? And we try to debunk people's myths. We say, did you know that the World Health Organization has said homosexuality is not a mental disease? So we're trying to see if we can move people's priors about kind of where homosexuality comes from and the degree to which it is or is not a mental disease. And then we had a placebo arm where we asked people something irrelevant and innocuous. We asked people, what is the population density of the country in which you live? And then we told them the correct population density of the country in which they live. And then we asked them a bunch of questions about what policies would you support? What do you think about gay people, et cetera? And we're leveraging this randomization across people, across treatment arms to identify, some kind of clean causal estimate of the effect of these information treatments relative to being told something innocuous and irrelevant on their stated support. And so the punchline of the paper is, if you randomly ended up in the treatment arm where we told you about, look, not being nice to queer people is costing you money, if you randomly ended up in that treatment arm, that significantly increased the likelihood that you said that you would support non-discrimination protection on the basis of sexual orientation. Not only did it increase your stated support for non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, it actually also had spillover effects. So it actually also significantly increased the likelihood that you had support for non-discrimination on the basis of disability, on the basis of religion, on the basis of gender, on the basis of race ethnicity, if I didn't already say that one. Now, these spillover effects were substantially smaller than the stated support for non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but we do find that kind of, being told about the dollar cost actually does change people's views. Interestingly enough, when we tell people about the dollar cost of what sexual orientation discrimination is costing their country, this has no effect on their kind of intrinsic attitudes about social things regarding queer people. So it doesn't change their view about whether homosexuality is justifiable. It doesn't change their view about whether queer people should be able to live freely. It doesn't change their view about, would they be ashamed if one of their close family members were gay or lesbian? So there's no kind of change in the, telling people that discrimination against queers is costing you money does increase their support for non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but it doesn't kind of change more fundamental social views. So in contrast, this other myth debunking where we say, look, the World Health Organization has said that homosexuality is not a mental disease. This treatment, if you ended up randomly in this second treatment arm, again, this is Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine, where a bunch of people think that queer people are just mentally deranged people. If we tell them, if you randomly ended up in this treatment arm and we tell you, look, the World Health Organization does not believe this to be true. They have said that homosexuality is not a mental disease. This leads to some modest improvement in fundamental intrinsic attitudes towards queer people. So if you randomly ended up into that T2 treatment arm, we do see some modest evidence of improvements in the likelihood that you say homosexuality is justifiable, small improvements in the likelihood that you say gays and lesbians should be free to live their life as they wish, but it has no effect on the other questions about support for non-discrimination and equal employment opportunities. So the punchline of this paper, and this is about what I'm going to say about the paper because I really want to switch to other EDI stuff, is that what we think we're showing is that in these three countries that have super strong, like unambiguously, they have anti-gay policies, their attitudes are really bad against queers relative to their Western European and Nordic European counterparts. Even in these countries where people really have quite strong negative views towards lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, what it looks like to us from this randomized information experiment is that people can separate those views. So what I mean by that is that it looks like people can say, okay, look, my discriminatory view or the absence of non-discrimination legislation is costing me money, dollars, and I and my neighbors would all have more money if we just like stopped that. And so, that might suggest that if we want to increase employment non-discrimination and equal opportunity for folks, even in these kind of places where attitudes are not great, you can do that by kind of, debunking people's myths about kind of the idea that discrimination is kind of painless or costless. In contrast, it's much harder to change people's intrinsic fundamental views about, homosexuality per se. And so we have a bunch of other results in the paper about trying to rule out things like, if you're concerned about things like experimenter demand effects, those types of things. We have a bunch of analyses showing there's no effect of either treatment on responses about status quo things about queer people. There's no effect on people's descriptions of how queer people are faring in their country and society at this point in time. So the effects are really on what they say, at least with respect to this first treatment, the effects are really on what they say they would kind of support. So this is kind of like a voting action, more similar to something like that. And so that's the paper in one slide. I'm not going to go through it, but I'm happy to share the tables and draft with you if you're actually deeply interested in this particular topic, and would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts on that. There's my email address if you're curious and want a copy of that paper. What I want to spend the rest of the time on, because I'm really excited to talk about this, is something that I'm really passionate about, and one of the things in my professional life that I am for sure most excited about and proudest of, and that is advancing LGBTQ equality within the American Economic Association and trying more broadly within academia, social science, et cetera. And this has been a multi-year process, and I want to be very clear, it certainly didn't start with me. So queers have been meeting at the AEAs for decades and decades. They've just been doing it kind of undercover. There have been some clandestine, like, hey, let's get together and talk about how we can change the AEA, et cetera, et cetera. But officially, things really took off in 2016 when the American Economic Association, for the very first time, paid for and sponsored a breakfast at the AEA meetings. Now, that year, the meetings were in San Francisco. So, there were tons of queer people who came out to these meetings. We had a big breakfast. The room was completely full, wall to wall. We went out to the bar afterwards. It was just like a big old fun time. And we convinced the AEA, we took a lot of photos, and we convinced the AEA, look, you have groups about how women are doing in the profession. You have groups about how racial and ethnic minorities are doing in the profession. There's a bunch of queers in the profession and you're not doing very much for them. We could do a lot for them if you kind of give us some resources and invest in us. So they gave us some modest resources and we started a newsletter. We met every year after that at the AEA. And this culminated in 2019 when the American Economic Association, which is a very old, straight, cis, het, white guy group, historically, that is changing, including at the leadership, with respect to the executive committee of the AEA. That changed in 2019 when we achieved full committee status. So Lee Badgett and I went to the AEA and said, this has been great. This ad hoc kind of quasi status has been great. We want a seat at the table, make us a full committee. And they did, through the help of very key individuals and allies on the AEA executive committee who stood up for us in closed door meetings and said, this is absolutely first order important. We have to do this. And what this means is a variety of things. For us, it means tangible resources. So a lot of the things that we do, which I'll show you in a minute, cost money. And so full committee status means we get a budget allocation every single year. That's really important. It also really means a seat at the table. So we report directly to the AEA executive committee, and that is huge. So every year getting direct entree in a closed door meeting to say what we have been working on and what we think is important to prioritize, I think has been transformative. And, we're consulted. So we have this, the AEA has the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession and this Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economic Profession. Those committees are routinely consulted about, what the slate of nominees looks like for AEA leadership. There have been a very large number of diversity-related concerns, issues, scandals, you might say, within the AEA, and these groups are consulted. We are now among the groups that are CC'd on those discussions and being able to have input. And I think that that's really important. And our friends in Europe, including Dario and other folks are starting similar activities. And so I encourage you, if you are based in Europe, to check out those as well. And that's one other just wonderful thing about, these types of forums is that we want to, I think, we have shared similar objectives and we want to kind of learn from each other. So for example, before we got full committee status, I went to the American Sociological Association, which is filled with queer people and queer organizations. I went to the American Political Science Association. I went to their annual meetings and I sat in on their queer committees and I learned, just was a fly on the wall to find out what is important to them, how they're strategizing, et cetera. And I learned a lot. The sociologists are doing things that the economists probably won't do for 5 or 10 years. Things like pronouns on everyone's name badge, things like making sure there's all gender restrooms at every conference, et cetera, which the economists, I think, are not doing. I really just want to say, before I get to the specific things that we're doing, this has been transformative in very hard to measure, but I think critically important ways. And it's visibility, right? So a couple of weeks ago on the front page of the AEA website, Lee did a podcast that was highlighted, about our Journal of Economic Perspectives paper that Dario was talking about. And so anybody who went to the AEA saw this beautiful picture of our co-author Lee, and you could click to the link and hear the podcast. And Lee is an order of magnitude more articulate than me. And so of course, it was amazing and wonderful. And just this level of publicity, of visibility, of the association saying, this is important to us, we are going to prioritize this, I think has been transformative. And then these are examples of specific things we're doing. I would love to, if you have any interest in learning more about these things, I've put the names of the folks here who have led the charge. Let me just briefly say, we have an annual business meeting at the AEAs every year. We do this thing called pink papers. I forget who actually came up with that term, but it's fabulous. And it's research every year based on LGBTQ economics topics. And now we have dedicated sessions that cannot be taken away from us on the program every year. So things like that only come with committee status. We also have a separate pink paper session where the field rotates every year, and we only invite queer identified authors to that call. So this year, for example, we said, if you're working on economic history or if you're working on development economics and you are queer identified, we will consider a separate session that's set aside just for you. And next year, it'll be a different field. We have, this thing is super relevant if you're here today, which is we have a separate online seminar series that Mike Martell created in the pandemic. And it's just the best thing since sliced bread. And we have 25 to 40 people every week. And it's all about research on LGBTQ people by economists and by economist adjacent types. If you're interested, you can come. You don't have to turn on your camera. You can come once a semester. You can come every single week. We invite you to come however much you want or are able. It's really a fun group. We have a newsletter that Bitsy Perlman at Census is leading up for us. We have this mentoring program that Nick Papageorge started, and Patrick Button will, I think, be taking the baton, where we match senior people with junior people. We match assistant professors with grad students and kind of talk about, one-on-one queer issues. We're going to give a research award for the first time this year. We have a separate social activities committee that Tatiana Homanoff at NYU is leading up, where we have like get-togethers and happy hours and in-person conference things that are starting again this fall. We have a Twitter handle that an enterprising grad student is running for us. Actually, I think Josh is on the call. Really grateful. All of this is volunteer effort. So one of the most amazing things about working with everybody on this page and associated with CSQIP is that nobody is getting paid $1 to do this. We are all just like committed to improving the lived experience of queers in the profession. And it's amazing. Like whenever we ask for help, more people step up and say, please let me help, than we can know what to do with. So that's like one of the best things that has happened to this. And then two things that I think are particularly relevant given Dario's talk is we're going to post a link to like, so you want to do queer research, but you don't know where to start. What are some public data sets that you might use, which may be a little bit less relevant for the Informs community, since I think many of the data sets you all think about are more proprietary in nature, but not totally sure about that since I don't run exactly in your circles. And so we will post that soon on the AEA website. It'll tell you what data sets are available, what's publicly available, what variables they have, et cetera. And then relatedly, teaching resources. So say that you want to add queer content to your course, we will post syllabi and examples of how to do that. Let me just end with, of course, a big thank you to Dwight and Caroline again, but just this plea that if you're here today and you're economist adjacent, you might consider yourself economist adjacent, or you want to learn more, a big thing that I would recommend you do is you sign up for our Google group. That's like a passive way, and you can do that on our AEA website. That'll tell you how to do that. That's kind of like a little bit of a passive way. We don't abuse that resource. We send emails at most like once every other week. During job market season, it's maybe once a week, and we try to collate, so we only send you one email per week, and it just tells you like the goings on, things you might want to be aware of, etc. And that's a really easy, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people on that list. That's a really easy way to like sit back and see what's happening, and then you can just come and go and click on the things that you want to join us for, and you are most welcome to join us at any and every event that we have. We want to grow a big tent, and that's one of the reasons why we're so happy to be invited today. So I'll close there. Thank you, Dwight.
Thank you so much, Kit and Dario, for putting this together. It's very comprehensive, informative on how we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for the LGBTQ community. I think we're now open for questions. I do see a question from Yash, and if I were to summarize this is pertaining to Dario's study. I think what Yash is trying to ask is, have you tried to do the comparison in the same census tract or block in the same state, and have you been able to control for political affiliations? Am I right, Yash? Yash, are you there? Yeah. Oh, I like your background. Nice.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, like Dario mentioned that you control these people are in the same city center and things like that. But if we go more granular, and how much of this is basically that most queer folk are likely to be more liberal than non-queer folk?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, first of all, you also mentioned the NHIS data, and we do use NHIS in our Journal of Economic Perspective article. We mainly rely on that data. In this paper, instead, I should double check, but if I remember well, there is no mode of transportation to work question in the NHIS data. So we cannot do the same kind of comparison, unfortunately. And it's the same, like in the general social survey, we have environmental preferences, we have political affiliation, but we don't have mode of transportation. So again, finding one data set where you have everything, it's always complicated. And that's one of the reasons, but we can definitely mention that. And as I say, we do that for city center, but we can also do something more granular as you suggested. So the good suggestion to look at PUMA, or yeah, look at more geographical, smaller geographical areas and see whether we still see an impact there, a difference there.
You can use the voting data sets basically to filter out census tracts which are very, polarized or things like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you. It's good.
I see Michael has a question. Michael, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for taking the question. So I asked this as an Informs member who teaches in a Department of Public Policy. So I'm pretty familiar with the work of applied economists who take a particular perspective on social policy work. And I respect and thank you so much, the two speakers, for everything that you've shared. But as a Informs member, I understand this distinction between research that wants to answer the question, what are distinctions between populations that are meaningful, and what might be the explanations about them, and what are the social implications of them, and other kinds of questions that are more prescriptive and more prospective in nature, related to decision making. What might it mean to formulate certain kinds of decision problems that take into account different types of concerns or different styles of decision makers, et cetera. So this is really a question for everyone. I don't want to put the economists in an uncomfortable place, but just to say that I'm very interested in thinking through, just as the question, what would LGBTQ economics look like? What could an LGBTQ decision sciences look like? I'm just putting that out there. Thank you very much.
There's an uncomfortable silence. Does anyone want to take a jab at it?
Probably I'll share something, because I have thought about this aspect, that how it comes to probably like business school professors' portfolio. And in discussion with someone, what I felt was they told me that research is me search. So you go through systems, you go through businesses on day-to-day life, you are able to probably realize and notice where is the system interacting with you differently. And that could be the starting point. Obviously, like reviewers will pan it by saying, where is the evidence? What's the practical? I think that's where Kit and Dario's studies will help us justify that these problems matter to businesses. Because I think in healthcare, at least I feel that when I go to a doctor, it's a very different way of interacting with a doctor if I'm interacting with a cis hetero male guy versus if I have LGBT friendly practice. So I think, to me, that seems like how we will come up with a business school kind of research, or a management or decision science kind of research, that how do systems and products are differently placed for us, and our interactions are different with them. I'll stop blabbering, but that's one thought I have.
Can I jump in, Dwight?
Yeah, please.
So I think that's thank you, Michael, for the question, and for not putting Dario and I and me on the spot because I'll speak for myself only, don't have a great answer to that, but I think it's a really important question. I will say, as somebody who's not a decision scientist, that it is related to one of the big open questions that Dario mentioned, which is, I think another way I think about a cousin of that question might be like, what is a queer managerial style? Like, what does that look like? And one reason I can't actually answer that for you is that we don't track things like which of the top CEO 500s are queer. But we could tell you which of them are women, and we could tell which of them are racial and ethnic minorities, and we could tell all these other demographic characteristics, and then we could use all kind of like data science things to like see how they differently allocate resources, and how they interact with subordinates, and how they organize their C-suite, etc. Those are types of things that if we just literally just collected that data among CEOs, that would maybe help get some purchase on, you know, something that might be related.
Hi, Jason over here at Tulane University. One thing to look forward to in this regard is the NASDAQ just amended their listing standards. One of the new listing standards is going to require companies to essentially say how many of their boards of members of the board of directors are LGBTQ plus or racial minority or women, and then explain why they don't have any of those individuals if they don't. So hopefully in the coming weeks, months, years, this data is going to be reported by publicly traded corporations.
Thank you for that. It's quite useful. I will also add that, I guess, as economists, we are typically uncomfortable making positive statements. Actually, the MBR usually suggests not to do that kind of things. But I know that things are different in different fields. But I will also say that, at least for us, it's very useful, at least at the beginning, to also show that sexual or gender minorities are underrepresented. One reason why in the economic profession was so difficult to start the group is that people were claiming that we don't have the data, we don't know actually if sexual minorities are an underrepresented minority in the economic profession. So without the data, you cannot make any claim about being underrepresented. And that's one of the reasons why with KIT, another paper that we wrote, is to show that sexual minorities are indeed underrepresented in other sciences, especially in the STEM field. And we hope that that's kind of a first step to then jump with some policy recommendation. But first, I think you have to need data to show that people are underrepresented. Otherwise, you cannot get the political traction. At least that's my opinion.
Priyank, you want to ask your question on the treatment?
I think it mentioned some details. So I think, and I'm sure like it's not something we can just go back and run the experiment again. But I was just thinking more from a higher level that it could be that some people change their minds when it is put as a cost. Like probably we could think about around us, our friends tend to react differently when you tell them statistics on, you know, things which are more in a cost perspective than saying on the other side. So I just wanted to see if that could be teased out. I think he gave some more information, so that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
I think Rishabh also has a question on, as a privileged queer person, my experiences are very different than those of another individual within these systems, for example, healthcare. How can these problems be identified and also rectified? Basically having more, reducing the disparities which the LGBTQ community faces across different disciplines. For example, healthcare versus management versus economics. How can these disparities in life experiences be reduced? Any thoughts?
And this is a general question I had, like besides the government provided sources of measurement of data, are there other ways people have or researchers have tried to quantify, the population, how much of it is served, underserved, and things like that? Like one of the things that I've always been intrigued by that because I study information systems is our information systems track a lot of this information implicitly. We, of course, there are privacy concerns and issues like that, but like Google basically knows how many gay people are there in a county. And, a lot of these apps know how many people are there in the county. So if you want to start up a clinic, if you want to start up, any testing center stuff, you have that data somewhere. It's just not available for public health. So has there been research into that? Do we know of things like that?
I think it just responded to your question. Respondi is a company who did this for us online. Kit, do you want to respond? Yeah.
I was responding to the earlier question, which
Earlier
was
question,
excellent,
okay.
and I apologize. I should really not multitask and listen to. I caught snippets of your other question just now, which is excellent. And I think if I heard it right, it's something like, how about non-government sources of data? Like, what are the other creative ways that people are kind of identifying these populations if you don't have access to internal Google data, et cetera? So I know that there's folks at Facebook who are doing really cool experiments. You know, any of these platforms where you can kind of signal your orientation. I don't know if people are doing this on Twitter, but it's very common, right, to see pride flags to kind of signal minority identity. At Facebook, I know there's a huge research team internally that is kind of working on or has worked on like how marriage equality or changes in public policies change people's support for queer people or their willingness to use a pride flag or to use a pride background and that kind of thing. So I definitely think that there are opportunities. And if anybody here is on Facebook and wants a collaborator, my name is Kit Carpenter and you can Google me. So I do think that people are kind of doing that stuff at within social media companies. Apart from that, I'm not sure. Certainly, you know, medical records is a thorny privacy but huge data opportunity for queer people. So one thing that's happening in our Nordic cousin friends research groups is identifying trans people through gender surgery, affirmation, confirmation, drug, you know, prescription drugs, etc. And in those places where everything's linked to everything, they have just like ridiculously amazing results that kind of jump right off the page about changes in people's earnings, their family structure, et cetera, associated with the timing of their gender transition. Obviously, you might wonder like what else is correlated with the timing of somebody's gender transition, but still relative to what we know now, which is like almost nothing, you know, I think these are big data opportunities. So in the United States, for example, you know, I think there are people who are proposing to work with like millions and millions and millions of insurance claims along those lines to help get at that. Now, it does introduce all this, like, what does it mean to medicalize somebody's orientation or gender identity? So there's always these trade-offs about, is what we learn worth kind of these inherent data issues we have to grapple with?
So just adding on to what Kit said, I think Elena, correct me if I'm wrong, Informs as an organization will also start collecting data on an individual's sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. I think the project is ongoing, right, Elena?
Yes, that's planned for 2021. So what we're trying to do is do a diversity, equity, and inclusion climate survey, and also collect more demographics. But we know it's going to be an uphill battle, and that some people are going to, you know, some people in the queer community are going to want to self-report because they want it to be tracked. And then there's others who are going to be fearful of organizations like Informs, who historically may not have been as accepting. So uphill battle, but we know we have to take step one.
Kit, you did mention about the LGBTQ working group within the American Economic Association. Could you share with us, I mean, I'm just piggybacking on what Elena said, you know, what was the uphill battle, if at all, that you all faced in establishing that working group?
So I actually like to think that a lot of what happened is a historical accident of the fact that I happen to be at Vanderbilt University, and the American Economic Association happens to be run out of Vanderbilt University by my wonderful, wonderful, wonderful colleague, Peter Rousseau, who has been a trusted advisor and champion of us throughout the process. So, you know, I didn't have to go far to ask, like, what do we need to do? And what are the roadblocks? And where are the landmines? You know, where are the dead bodies buried, so to speak? And so we just had all kinds of internal support from the get-go. And, you know, I think the biggest challenges are the ones that you're probably thinking of, which is like, what does it mean when the executive committee is mostly filled with 65 to 80-year-old white men who don't know that they have a gender identity or a sexual orientation? I mean, I don't mean to, you know, that's a bit much, but you get the idea. Like, these are not people who are comfortable or are routinely sitting around talking about their sexual orientation, their gender identity. And so things like that, where I think the challenges, like, how do we navigate this? How much do we push, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, as to Elena's point, I think it's very much that first step is like so critical. So the AEA is also doing this thing that you just mentioned, Informs is doing. And this, like, we're decades behind public health, by the way, right? So the whole goal, I think, is to say, look, everybody has a sexual orientation. Everybody has a gender identity. It is not going to be normalized until we start thinking of it and asking people about it in the same way that we ask them about their education and their marital status and their race, ethnicity, and their religion, right? All of these surveys, we ask all of these questions and we don't think twice about adding them. But in other surveys, it's like, oh, we really need to be careful about it. And that's not the right way to think about it. We need to change people's perceptions so that, you know, it's not taboo or stigmatized or whatever, that yes, you have a sexual orientation, you have a gender identity, you have a gender expression, and we're curious about it because it is related to your ability to succeed in society. And we need to know how big the gaps are, where the gaps are, what can we be done about the gaps in order to address them.
Awesome. That's good to know. I see that we have 2 more minutes. Any other questions, thoughts? I see Priyank's hand up. Yes, Priyank.
Actually, I think probably it's maybe from the defensiveness it's but what Elena and Kit just said, to me, it shows that even at the most learned communities like Informs and AEA, we have issues that would exist in any other sample that you take. So going back to what Rishabh asked, I think if we are able to answer these questions, even in a different pool of people, probably the magnitude of impact might be lower, but I think the issue will still exist. You'll still find the evidence for differentiation, just that probably the value of data will be different. So I still feel that it is a good point to start from whichever pool can be examined. If we are privileged to show our sexual orientation, let's start there, because the difference I'm sure will exist. I don't think it will not be there because it's Informs or healthcare or AAA. So just to say that I think wherever we start, it's important to start, and there you and Kit are doing it wonderfully. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyank. That was a wonderful concluding thought. I did not say anything more. So just to conclude, I just wanted to let all of you know that Chris Tang from UCLA and Ting-Long Dai from Johns Hopkins, they are organizing a panel discussion on LGBTQ issues within Informs on Friday, November 12th, noon to 1:30 p.m. US Eastern Time via Zoom. We will share the details of this panel discussion through emails and social media. So please stay tuned. And thank you again, everybody. I'm finishing on time. So thanks again. This was a lovely, wonderful, thoughtful discussion. And keep in touch, people. Thank you.
Thank you.